Welcome to Traveling Through Secure API with Python and Auth0. Hi, I'm Temporal, a developer advocate here at Auth0. I'm also a podcaster here in Brazil. I have a podcast called Pizza de Dados, and it's a podcast about data science. I was a data scientist for many years before I joined Auth0, and me and a couple of friends decided to create this podcast to improve data literacy here in Brazil. I'm also an instructor on Data Bootcamp, a bootcamp about data science here in Brazil as well, and LinkedIn Learning on a number of subjects. So check out my social media to find out more. Now, before we get started, I want to talk to you about Python and the Python community. I love to have the time to have this interaction with people and show you a little bit of the things that I learned and how to put together some of the cool technologies that we use on a daily basis. And before we get started, I have a question for you. So, do you know how easy it can be to protect an API using Python and Auth0? If you come with me on this journey, you'll learn how to do just that. And before we get started, I want to give you a sneak peek on what we are going to build together today. And this is the map. You are going to be able to build a map for yourself to show all the places and all the cool events that you've been through to all your friends and family. Now, let's talk about some code. So, if you are talking about code, what we are going to build is an API with 4 endpoints using Flask, a web framework in Python. We are also going to do a little bit of data manipulation with pandas, the Python library for dealing with data, and tabular content. We are also going to protect endpoints with Auth0 to make sure that only you can do data manipulation, can change your data. And after that, we are going to deploy it to the cloud using Heroku to make sure that you can share that with friends, family, and everybody else. Now, let's see the code. And yes, we are going to see a bunch of Python code right now. So, before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit on how I got started with talking and sharing knowledge. So, it was a long time ago, I gave my first talk at the city I was living at the moment, in Ribeirão Preto. I was super nervous, but that talk was the first time that I actually realized that everything that I did as a data scientist in R could be done in Python. And my mind went racing. I was mind blown. I could not wait for the time that I could put everything together and build all the cool things that you can see out there. So this always brings me to the basics, the very beginning of every project. Whether it be in data science or web development, you have to begin somewhere. And when I'm doing APIs, no matter what the APIs are for, I'll always start with 2 endpoints. The get endpoint for home, where in this case, I'm showing the map, and the endpoint for oops, where I show a little bit of HTML just to say, hey, something went wrong, please go back. Now, you may be wondering, if you don't know Python, if you don't know Flask, how does that look like? How many lines of code is that? Do I have to build a very complex code to start? And the answer is no, actually you don't. So this is what my home endpoint and my oops endpoint looks like. So you start your Flask app and then you define both endpoints, and I'm already using Flask 2.0, which gives me very idiomatic way to say each endpoint receives these HTTP methods. So in the home endpoint, I have an index.html file that is my map. And in the oops endpoint, I only have a simple text message saying something went wrong, please go back. And all of this is rendered via Flask with the render template method. Now, after I get done with the basics and I know my Flask app can be run and everything is sorted out, I start with the interesting endpoints, the ones I'm going to protect. In this case, I made 2 endpoints, the ping and the places endpoints. Let's take a closer look at that. So the ping endpoint is responsible for regenerating my map. while developing, I might have to regenerate my map a couple of times until I get everything figured out, until I get my helper functions ready and everything working. So I create my ping endpoint because, well, once I deploy everything to production, I might need to do that again for some reason. In this case, the ping endpoint is really simple. It just runs a function called createMap, and that function is responsible for regenerating the map and saving it again on the index.html file. If something goes wrong, then I redirect people for the oops endpoint that shows that friendly message to go back. Now, other than that, I have my places endpoint. And this is responsible for adding a new place to my data set, my collection of cities, the cities that I want to pinpoint on my map. It does that by reading the request that it got, the post request that it got. It gets the body of that message, it gets the JSON, and add it to my data set as a new line. After that, it runs the createMap function once more, because that function is going to generate my map with the new data set. And finally, it renders the template, or if something goes wrong in the process, it redirects everybody to the oops endpoint. Now, take a note, this endpoint is not protected yet, but we are going to get to that part in a bit. Now, you may have heard me talking about data science and data, and more data, right? And you may be wondering, what does that data look like? What data do I need to actually create this map? Is it complex? Is it very long? So let's take a look at that. But if you are looking at data, I have a full disclosure to make. Data can be really tricky, and especially if you don't have all the data at your disposal. So once I traveled to Austria to record a video course. Before that, everybody told me, hey, prepare yourself. You're going to speak a lot. Your voice is something that you have to take care of. And I thought, oh, come on. I give talks all the time, and I do pair programming, and I talk a lot, every day. I have a number of meetings where I can have to explain things to people. It's something that is going to be easy for me. Barely did I know that I didn't talk as much as I thought. Until you have to actually talk 8 hours a day for recording videos for a course, and the second day your voice starts to give out, you haven't spoken too much. Trust me, I've been there. Now, why is that important? Because the way you look at your data and the data points that you have will influence on how you're going to show that data. In this case, my data set looks right now like this. I have 9 cities, I have the name of each city, and I have a latitude and a longitude for that city, because I need that information to pinpoint that city in my map, right? Okay, now that I have my data, what do? I need to read this data, and I need to actually load it into my map, right? So the first step for loading your data is actually creating a function to do that. In this case, I separated all the functions that do data manipulation in a new file called maps.py, and these functions are going to be imported into my app. So let's take a look at each of the steps. First, I need to read my data before I can add cities to my map. So my data is stored in GitHub. And I can use PyGithub, a library in Python, to access GitHub information, deal with commits, right on the command line. Right now, what this code does is reading the data from GitHub that I have an access token to. It gets all the contents, it transforms into a string format that pandas can understand, and then pass it on to pandas. And pandas is going to be my best friend right now, because once I have to loop over the data to edit the cities, it's going to be really helpful because it has a bunch of built-in methods that we can use. Now, I loaded my data, I have my data set ready, and I can get started. But how can you add a location if you don't have a map? So the next step is to add a map. And I created this function that creates an empty map And for that, I need to give a location as a center of the map, and I need to give it a zoom factor to start. So this says how close am I to the map once I look at it on my browser or any other app that you are using. And to add the markers to my map, I can use the marker object to create the map. Both of the map and the marker objects come from the volume package. And the marker works just like my map. It takes a location, a latitude, and a longitude for each place that you want to pinpoint, and any other information that you might want to give it, like a color or the name of each city. In this case, all of my cities are colored the same. They are all blue, the standard default value. But I also gave it the name of the city to make it a little bit easier so you don't have to actually zoom into the map to see which city is which, especially if you have a bunch of cities bundled up together in the same region. After that, I just add the marker to the map and I'm pretty much done. Now, my data set is going to grow, at least I hope so, because I love traveling and meeting new people and going to technology events. So I actually need a function to update this data set in GitHub. And to do that, I did the same way that I did for loading it. I access GitHub, I get the repository information, and then I commit my new information to that same file, and everything is ready. The file is updated, and then I have all my data stored and safe. Finally, it's time to bring it all together. So I created two functions that I'm going to use on my endpoints, because I don't want my endpoints to know all of this information. The endpoint doesn't need to know that I'm using GitHub to store my data. So in case I want to refactor this later and use some other method for storing the data set, I can, and the endpoint doesn't have to change. I can just update my functions. But right now, what I did is create a create map function that is going to load the data set, create the map, add the markers, and finally update the index file inside my templates folder. I also have some other function that is responsible only for loading the data set and adding a new line at the end of the data set. Make sure that I don't have any duplicates in there so that I can update the data on my pandas data frame. And that is it. All the data manipulation and the map regeneration process is done. And now you may be wondering, okay, but how do we protect the endpoints? Because I want to deploy this API eventually to the cloud, right? I don't want somebody else to mess with my data. So how do I do that? And the answer is protect your endpoints. And when I talk about protection of my endpoints, I could choose either Auth0 or Auth0 as options for my API. Anyways, whether you go with Auth0 or Auth0, you'll be well served. They are going to protect your endpoints with great quality. But every time that I talk about protection, I always remember that I'm relying on my friends to do that. And that always brings me to a very funny story once before. So, there was little old me going to my first big Python event. I was super excited. I had many tutorials that I wanted to watch, many talks that I wanted to see, many friends that I wanted to meet again, and new friends to make. But on the very first day, something happened, and it was not that nice. Well, going to have lunch, walking on the road, I stepped on a ditch, and I twisted my ankle. I twisted my ankle so bad that I had to go to the hospital, immobilize it, to make sure that nothing wrong would happen with my ankle. So you could imagine, like, if you were in the same situation as me, you probably said, oh my God, this is it, it's over. I'm not going to enjoy the rest of the event. But once again, I relied on my friends to make sure that I had a lot of happy memories from that event. And it was great. And you can see in this picture, my foot is up on a little stool on the very first happy hour of the event, me having friends over to talk, hey, are you okay, and everything else. So always rely on your friends to make sure that you are okay. So let's take a look what you need to do to protect your API. In this case, I'm using Auth0. So if you don't have an Auth0 account yet, you need to create that. And after you create your Auth0 account, you can log into your account and you see the dashboard, just like what I have here on this image. On your left-hand side, you see a menu. And in that menu, you can find the application section. On that section, you can find the APIs, and that's where you want to click to actually create something to protect your API. So once you click there, you'll be taken to an API list. Now, if you're new to Auth0, you're only going to see the Auth0 management API on this list. In my case, because I have another sample app that I was working on at the moment of these screenshots, I had also on the base API, but you can just ignore that for the moment. What you want to do is create your API. So you're going to click on the button on the top right corner so you can see the form for naming your API. Now, quick tip, use a very good name. And a name that represents what your API does, because once you have a list of APIs, it can be pretty difficult to find whichever one you want. So in this case, I gave it the name, Where Have I Been? And I also had to choose an identifier. Now, the identifier you can't change later. So be careful which one you choose. Because this is a Where Have I Been API that is going to serve a map, I picked the first letter of each word to make my identifier. And this identifier is going to be used as an audience for validating your JWT tokens. Now, once you click on Create, you'll be taken to your API page inside the dashboard. And you can look over a bunch of documentation here, like the quick start on how to start with your APIs, your settings tab, and everything else. But what you want is go into the Test tab. There, you see instructions on how to get your access token. Because once your endpoints are protected, you're going to need the access token to access them. That's how you protect your endpoints. Now, there is a couple of ways that you can get your access token, but the first one is doing a curl request to the OAuth token endpoint on Auth0. Now you may be wondering, but right now my code isn't protected. What do I need to change on my code? And that's where the magic comes in. You have to add two decorators. One, the cross-orange one, that makes sure that you have your content type and authorization headers. And you're going to add another decorator called requires auth. And you're going to add those two decorators on top of each endpoint that you want to protect. And the requires auth actually comes from Auth0. We implemented that for you. So you can just copy the code for each of the requires auth decorator into your application and just use it. And you can see the code inside our quick starts under the created JWT validation decorator. Now, let's go back to our dashboard. If you don't want to do a pull request to get your token, you can just copy it from the task page, right below the pull request. And that is it. You are done and ready to go. But it's deploy time. It's time that you put it on the cloud so that you can share that with your friends. And all that you've been doing so far is preparation, right? And preparation is key. Did I ever tell you about the time where I didn't prepare enough for traveling that I had to do? So that was me going to give a talk at an event called Campus Party here in Brazil. And Campus Party is a camping event. That should be enough for me guessing that I needed camping gear, right? But I didn't. I don't know why. It is a mystery to me until this day why I didn't figure it out before. So you get there, you receive a tent from the event committee and a towel, but that's it. Unless you have everything else, you're not going to be able to sleep or anything else. So I didn't bring a sleeping bag or a mattress or, I don't know, something to cover myself with because it was in the middle of the winter. And there I went to my event, my camping event, without any camping gear. Can you guess what happened? It was pretty interesting thing to do. So once again, I could rely on my friends. They helped me out with some camping gear and I was set. But remember, you have to prepare yourself. In the case of APIs and deploy them to Auth0, for me, the last part of preparation is adding the 2 files that Heroku needs to actually run your app. So the first one is the proc file. And the proc file tells Heroku how to run your web app. In this case, I'm using Unicorn, a production-ready server that can run my app. And it works like this. You call Unicorn and you give your app name and where Unicorn can find your app definition. And that is it. Heroku is ready to run your app. But other than that, you also need to tell Heroku how to install all the dependencies that you need for your app. And this comes from a file called pip file. And pip file has a source where to download the packages from, a list of packages, and their versions, and what version of Python you are using. In this case, I'm using Python 3.6, and that's well enough. Now you're ready to deploy. You just have to log into your Heroku account. If you don't have one, you can create one for free, and then you do basically install the Heroku CLI on your machine, and you do Heroku logging. And you can push your code to Heroku, just like you do with GitHub or any other Git repository. You just do git push, Heroku, remote name. And that is it. I'm not going to go into further details, but Heroku has a great documentation that you can look over all the steps that you needed to do. And now you may be wondering, okay, I know the code, everything's deployed. Let's see how it looks in real life. Now, this is Insomnia. So Insomnia helps me and you and any other developer to have all the requests that we need to use on a daily basis. So here I have set up all the requests that I'm going to need to regenerate my map, to get my home map, or to create a new place, for example. So the first thing I want to show you is how to get your home page, that is your map. And once I click send, this is going to run and grab the information that you see on your browser. Now, keep in mind that Insomnia has a small preview, and because my map has a zoom factor of 3, now what happens is I have to zoom out to see all of my cities that I just did. Okay, now remember, what we want to do is actually access our protected endpoints to make our requests and add more information to our map. So the first thing you need to do is either grab your access token from Auth0 dashboard or set up a request in Insomnia so you can get that. And what I did was set up this request here, and it's a post request. On the body of my request, I pass along my client ID, my client secret, the audience from my API, and the grant type, which is client credentials. Now, I'm not showing this because, well, you must keep your secret and your information safe. So Insomnia helps me because I can set up all of this and keep it safe, tucked away out of prying eyes. Now, if I do a send request here, you see my access token for my API. That is a JWT here that you can see. And I can change this to make it a little bit nicer. And if I do this, you can see all printed out really pretty. Now, what I did is for my requests on my protected endpoints, I set it up so that every time that I do this request to get a new access token, for example, it is automatically updated. So once I go into generate my new map, and if I go on the part of Toti, and if I go on the tab that is called here bearer, because I already have it set up, you can see that I have a response body attribute here. That is my exactly JWT that you just saw a couple of seconds ago. But I could have any other type of authentication here that Insomnia provides you already set up from the beginning. In this case, I'm using a bearer token. Now, my request doesn't have to have anybody just to regenerate my map. So I can pretty much just do send here, and this is going to update the index HTML file. Now, once more, I have to zoom out to see all of my cities, and because I didn't change anything on my data, there is no different city on my map. I can even scroll in, I can even zoom in and see here, for example, Florianopolis, the city where I twisted my ankle. Now, let's see how we can actually add a new city. And in this case, I'm adding the city called São José. And São José is the place that I'm talking to you right now. And I'm very happy to be here. It's really close to Florianopolis. Once more, it has a barrier token here that I set up the same way that I did for regenerating my map. And if I send this request, and if I zoom out, you can see here that I have São José. But I'm going to scroll in so you can take a closer look. So in Florianopolis, where I went to my first Python Brazil, my big Python event, and I twisted my ankle, and São José is right here, very close to Florianopolis, all this area. And this was it. Now you know everything you need to build your own map. And why not get started right now with the city that you are watching this talk? You can find me on every social media at Temporal, and I hope you had a good time. See ya!